Early pioneers. It is striking how much the early pioneers of analysis focused on the body to understand the psychology of the human being. Pierre Janet was the first theorist and practitioner to emphasize the importance of the sense and emotion in relation to the body and dissociation. His psychological model of the mind and his method of working, psychological analysis, provided first steps to understand and treat patients with hysteria. It is considered that he introduced the concept of subconscious, and some suggest that Freud's reference to his practical work and theory as psychoanalysis was taken from Janet's psychological analysis. In psychological automatism and later in major symptoms of hysteria, Janet introduced and developed the concept of the fixed idea. This is a thought that is no longer connected to consciousness, but instead has an unconscious core, accessible only through hypnosis. According to Janet, the fixed idea could to some extent be functioning autonomously from the self, and in some circumstances be fully separate. Janet understood the psyche to be functioning economically, based on exhaustion, and was therefore skeptical about the content of the fixed idea. Clinically, the fixed idea existed as a thought that was doomed to remain unchanged in the mind while the body expressed the affect hysterically. Janet suggested that where feelings and sensations exist, movement also exists. An idea or a thought has a natural tendency to develop in an act, if one could say it cannot be held in mind. Therefore, Janet inevitably emphasized the unity of the body and mind through the connection of body, affect, mind, by basing the origin of affect in the body. Freud's affect trauma model is not far removed from Janet's model of trauma-induced hysteria, albeit that Janet's model includes no reference to the influence of child development, whereas Freud considered that the fixed idea was reflective of childhood trauma and gave it a diagnostic value. He later abandoned the affect trauma theory in favor of regression and the concept of repressed unconscious when, as he stated in his letters to Fliess, he no longer believed his hysterics when he thought about infantile sexuality. The model of dissociation generally, both in Freud's initial model of the mind and Janet's concept of the idée fixe, was spatial. In Freud's model, this was later replaced by the more temporal sexual stages. Jung, who studied with Janet for some time in 1902, developed a complex theory, closely following Janet's model. He likened his idea of the complex to Janet's idée fixe. The psyche existed of an infinite number of unconscious complexes which could equally have autonomous qualities. In his earlier work, Jung too postulated a biological force through the introduction of his concept of the libido, or psychic energy. But as his work developed, he focused on the archetypes as well as symbols, myths and religion, or as some might say, the spiritual aspect of the mind. Jung described the spiritual as being the antithesis of the instinct. Elsewhere, he speaks of a relationship of complementarity between physis and spirit, so that one reflects the other, but this nevertheless implies a conceptual division between them. Later, Jung would underpin his notion of the complex by the theory of the archetypes. Hall suggested that Jung's concept of the archetype was a hybrid between Freud and the French school, Janet, Flournoy and Charcot. In a similar vein, Carvello links Jung with Matablanco, suggesting that the collective unconscious is unrepressed while the personal unconscious is repressed, as in Freud's model. This distinction helps to make Jung's model more accessible for understanding psychotic processes, since Carvello considers that the archetypes are formulated by Jung, the formulators as formulated by Jung are equivalent to core affective states in the unrepressed unconscious. Affective interpersonal analysis. Zinkin, too, questioned the origin of the archetype and brought forward evidence that unconscious fantasies like archetypes could not be innate. It seems to me that the increasing criticism of innateness led analysts to have to reconsider the conception of unconscious fantasy. Zinken introduced the theory of Stern, who had focused on understanding observable early developmental relational behavior in the infant to develop new ways of working in analysis on the basis of the infant's subjective sense of self. Astor, James Astor, firmly rebuked Zinken's challenge of Klein's theory and the influence of Kleinian metapsychology on analysis. Astor, basing his opinions on Fordham's model of child development and the original psychosomatic self, makes the not uninteresting point that imagery is initially bodily, only to become more differentiated as the infant develops. This assertion would underline the direct connection between body and affect, as Genet had suggested. Influenced by Bowlby, Stern and infant research, Lichtenberg developed his theory of motivational systems and said that rather than adopting the traditional position of interpreting the present in terms of the past, empathic attention is given to affect and emotion in the here and now. He pointed to patients who may have a lack of symbolizing capacity and said, quote, "Sensation, perception and reality are intertwined before symbolic logic can take hold, and when symbolic logic does develop, the two generally coexist." Quote. Much in line with Astor's point. Mario Jacobi, influenced by Lichtenberg, discussed the question of fantasy and formation of symbols in infancy. He concluded, quote, that in the first year of life, creativity expresses itself in the form of activity. End of quote. A suggestion, again, resonates with Genet's emphasis on the importance of movement in hysterical states and underlines the unavailability of symbols in the psyche in early developmental processes. In other words, the symbol may be preceded by corporeal movement or affect expressed by the body. The question of severe trauma, not necessarily caused by developmental disturbance, and representation, or rather the lack of it, is powerfully addressed by Angela Connolly. Writing about survivors of the Holocaust and the Soviet gulags, she suggests that they have nothing left but void. There is no representation and no affect. Significant parts of being, clusters of existence, have become unavailable to consciousness. She goes on to say that children of survivors developed a failure of metaphorization or ability to represent, such as, I think, is also observable in some children who are adopted early in their life or who suffered disturbing separations from their caregivers. These children too have profound disturbances of the ability to symbolize, as will become clear in the clinical case vignettes that I will discuss. The experienced affect does not develop into a representation and may be enacted by the body. In these situations, affect is not felt but lived. The imagery is expressed through the body, as Astor said. The work of Armando Ferrari is helpful when dealing with lost and unprocessed affect. Ferrari, proposing a biological model, suggested that initially there is only body, with a mind in the body ready to develop. Affect through the mother's reverie creates awareness of frustration and comfort. The mother helps, as an auxiliary, to organize the emotions and sensations emanating from the infant's body. With growing consciousness, the affects are eclipsed to make way for a body and mind that interconnect. It is this relationship between the concrete original object, the body, and the mind which is the central thesis of Ferrari's theory. The first relation, which he called the vertical axis, is the basis of all further relationships of the ego with others. This relationship with the external world, Ferrari called the horizontal axis. The mind holds the affects as the mother held the infant's distress. Now, representations of affects can begin to develop in the mind. Ferrari suggests that the therapeutic endeavor should focus on what he defined as the vertical axis, to develop an awareness of emotion and sensation. This implies a move away from transference, while not dispensing altogether with or disputing its relevance, with the analyst necessarily focusing on the countertransference, making analysis available to people with severe developmental trauma, psychosomatic symptomatology and anorexia, for example. I am making the point, which I develop further on, that we see patients who may not be able to work with object relations interpretations because they do not have the mental apparatus to symbolize and seek meaning. They do not have an adequate, effective foundations, as Alvarez would say, upon which an ego, an object and an identity can be built.